The early morning sun filtered through the towering buildings of Maple Avenue, casting long shadows over the pavement as the city of Oak Ridge slowly began to stir to life. The usual bustle of traffic and pedestrians was absent at this hour, the streets still quieter than they would be a few hours later. Officer Karen Mitchell stood at the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, sipping from her coffee cup, savoring the brief moment of peace before her shift truly began. She had been on patrol in Oak Ridge for over 10 years, and though it was a city filled with the usual chaos, she had grown accustomed to it, the daily routines, the quiet moments before things got hectic, the small but comforting familiarity of her job. Her shift had just started, and it was a routine morning. The usual hum of distant cars, the soft rustle of leaves in the trees above, and the occasional hum of someone's phone buzzing in the distance. The city was waking up to another ordinary day, or so it seemed. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A small brown dog suddenly appeared from around the corner, its tail wagging frantically, a blur of fur as it bolted straight toward Karen. Its tiny paws beat a rapid rhythm against the concrete, its body trembling with what seemed to be sheer urgency. Karen's brow furrowed in confusion as the dog approached, its frantic energy unmistakable. It was not just running, it was racing toward her, its eyes wide, searching, desperate. For a brief moment, Karen froze, wondering why such a small animal would be in such a hurry. She looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the dog. The world around her carried on, people were starting to fill the sidewalks, cars whizzed by, and the morning routines continued. But to Karen, it felt as though time had stopped for just a second, allowing her to focus solely on this strange, frantic creature that had suddenly entered her life. The dog skidded to a stop in front of her, looking up at her with wide, pleading eyes. It barked once, and then again, each bark sharp, urgent. Karen instinctively crouched down, her hand outstretched as she attempted to calm the dog. "Hey there, little guy," Karen said softly, her voice cutting through the noise of the city. "What's wrong? Why are you in such a rush?" But instead of sitting or calming down, the dog's tail wagged even more rapidly, as if it were trying to convey a message, something that Karen couldn't quite understand yet. It pawed at her pants and then, before she could react, the dog suddenly darted away from her, looking back as if to check if she was following. Curiosity piqued, Karen stood up, her hand still outstretched as she took a step forward. She exchanged a glance with a few pedestrians who had paused to watch the strange interaction. Their faces were a mix of confusion and amusement, some shaking their heads, others chuckling softly at the sight. But Karen wasn't laughing. There was something about the way the dog was acting, the urgency in its movements, that told her this was no ordinary morning encounter. The dog barked again, more insistent this time, and then dashed ahead, looking back at her to make sure she was following. Without hesitation, Karen followed, instinctively resting a hand on the holster at her hip. Her partner was parked nearby, so she signaled to him, her eyes scanning the street, making sure everything was clear. There was nothing about the situation that screamed danger, nothing obvious, but something about the dog's behavior had triggered her instincts. It was a feeling she couldn't quite shake, and Karen trusted that gut feeling. She followed the dog through a narrow alleyway, the usual sounds of the city fading behind her. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until the sounds of honking horns and busy streets were replaced by the sound of the dog's desperate paws hitting the ground. Karen's eyes never left the little creature ahead of her. She couldn't help but feel that it was leading her somewhere. But where? The alleyway opened up to a large, abandoned construction site, the skeletal framework of a half-built building casting long shadows in the early morning light. The dog skidded to a halt in front of a rusted gate, its barking louder now, more desperate. It scratched at the dirt with its paws, as if urging Karen to come closer, as if it had found something that needed immediate attention. Karen slowed her pace, her senses heightened now as she surveyed the eerie scene around her. The construction site was quiet, eerily quiet. The site had been left abandoned for months, its unfinished skeleton casting a haunting silhouette against the sky. Old metal beams, scattered construction materials, and piles of discarded bricks lay scattered across the grounds, and overgrown weeds began to creep through the cracks in the concrete. The dog's frantic barks echoed through the otherwise silent site, its body shaking with something that Karen could not yet comprehend. Karen took a cautious step forward, her radio crackling softly with static as she whispered into the device, "This is Officer Mitchell. I'm at the construction site off Maple Avenue. I need backup. Something's off here." The radio crackled again as a voice responded, "Copy that, Karen. Backup is on the way." She nodded, her hand on her sidearm as she moved closer to the gate. The dog had stopped barking and was now standing still, staring at the area beyond the gate with a look of focused intensity. It was as though it had found something, and it was waiting for Karen to see it, too. Karen stepped closer, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She glanced around the site, every creak of metal, every shifting shadow, felt amplified in the stillness. As she reached the gate, her eyes flicked to the ground, and that's when she saw it. A faint trail of blood, barely noticeable, leading deeper into the site. A chill ran down her spine as she knelt down to get a closer look. The blood was fresh. This wasn't just some old leftover mess from a previous accident. Someone had been here recently. The thought sent a jolt of urgency through her. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered to the dog, who stood perfectly still, as if in answer to her question, its tail swaying back and forth slowly. Karen's heart raced as she stood up, brushing dirt from her uniform. This wasn't just a curious dog looking for attention. This was a desperate creature trying to tell her something. She had a sudden realization. Something wasn't right, and this dog was her only clue. She quickly grabbed her radio again. "I need immediate backup and medical assistance at the abandoned construction site off Maple Avenue. Possible injured party. We're looking at a possible crime scene." As her heart hammered in her chest, she turned to the dog, who was now pacing anxiously in front of her, waiting for her to make her next move. With no time to waste, Karen pushed open the rusted gate. She stepped carefully onto the uneven ground, the dog trotting ahead of her with its tail raised, as though it had taken charge of this mission. The site, once filled with the sounds of construction and workers, was now a haunting reminder of something darker. Karen's pulse quickened as she followed the dog deeper into the abandoned site, unsure of what awaited her.
But one thing was for certain, this was no ordinary morning. Something was unfolding here, something that would change everything. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of brisk morning that held a hint of the coming warmth of the day. The city of Oak Ridge, though only a medium-sized urban hub, had always held a special place in Karen's heart. The streets had their own rhythm, something she had learned to appreciate over the years. The hustle and bustle of Oak Ridge never quite stopped. Even in the early hours, when the city was supposed to rest, it was alive with the gentle hum of progress. And on that particular morning, Oak Ridge was no different. The sun, still low on the horizon, bathed the buildings in a soft glow of gold, casting long shadows across the streets. The orange and pink hues of the dawn sky seemed to paint a picture of serenity and promise. The kind of dawn that signified the start of something new. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the city like fingers of warmth reaching into the corners of the streets, slowly dissolving the lingering night mist. Pedestrians began to trickle into the streets, their footsteps a quiet rhythm on the sidewalks as they made. For Karen, mornings were routine. She had seen the same faces walking by every day, heard the same cars rumbling down the street, felt the same city vibrations in her bones. It was a comfort of sorts, knowing that no matter how chaotic things got, this routine, the quiet, predictable flow of life, was always there. It was the calm before the storm, the stillness before the unexpected rushed in, as it inevitably always did. Yet, on this morning, things felt different. As she continued to sip from her coffee, her eyes scanned the street, her trained gaze observing the flow of people, the movement of vehicles, and the overall atmosphere. Nothing was out of the ordinary, at least not yet. The sun was climbing higher, casting more light on the sidewalk, and everything seemed to be unfolding just as it had every other morning. The sound of a bus arriving at the nearby stop broke the silence as passengers shuffled on and off, exchanging pleasantries as they started their daily routines. But then, as the city continued to wake, something caught Karen's attention. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the energy around her. A small brown dog had appeared from the crowd, its tiny legs moving quickly through the crowd, weaving between pedestrians like a tiny shadow, drawing Karen's gaze with an odd, urgent energy. It was an unusual sight, but nothing that would have drawn immediate concern. People often rushed about the streets in a hurry, and animals, lost or frightened, had a tendency to wander into the bustling city center from time to time. However, this dog was different. There was an air of frantic urgency that seemed to hang in the dog's every movement, a sharp contrast to the otherwise laid-back, predictable pace of Oakridge's morning. The dog wasn't simply moving, it was running with a sense of desperation, as if it had a purpose, something driving it forward, something Karen could not yet understand. She paused, watching the dog's every move as it barreled toward her, its eyes wild and panicked, its tail wagging furiously. A momentary sense of unease stirred in Karen's chest. She had seen a lot over the years, dangerous situations, distress calls, criminals on the run, but this was different. This wasn't just an animal lost in the crowd, this was something else. The dog, in its own way, seemed to be trying to communicate, to tell her something. But what? And why her? As Karen watched the dog approach, she heard the normal background noises of the city, the cars, the chatter, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians, all seemed to fade into the background. In that instant it was as if the world had gone silent, focusing entirely on the small animal at her feet. It felt like the moment before a thunderstorm, a quiet before something unknown and unpredictable would change everything. Despite the stillness, the city continued to breathe around her, the hum of life ever present, but now tinged with an unsettling feeling. It was as though the city, too, was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Karen knew that feeling all too well, the feeling that a calm moment was just the beginning of something much more complicated.
Her instincts kicked in. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as the dog tugged at her pant leg, its frantic movements becoming more insistent. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or a harmless distraction in an otherwise ordinary morning. But something told her not to dismiss it. Something told her this was not just another morning. And so, Karen followed. As she walked behind the dog, the sound of her footsteps blending with the growing hum of the city, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been drawn into something far greater than a simple early morning patrol. The dog, with its frantic urgency, seemed to know something she didn't. It wasn't simply running, it was leading her somewhere, towards something unknown, something that would shatter the calm of this morning and pull her deeper into an unexpected journey. The dog's tail continued to wag, its eyes locked on Karen as if to say, "Come with me. You need to see this." And without fully understanding why, Karen followed. The first encounter with the dog, the sound of the dog's frantic barking pierced through the rhythmic hum of the city, sharp and insistent. Karen, though well accustomed to the random disturbances that came with the territory of patrolling the streets, felt a strange pull toward this particular animal. She had seen stray dogs wandering the streets before, some hungry, some lost, but none had ever approached her in such an urgent, almost desperate manner. The tiny brown dog, with its wide, pleading eyes and trembling body, wasn't just barking. It was as if the creature was trying to communicate, trying to convey something that Karen couldn't quite put her finger on. As it skidded to a halt in front of her, the dog's tail wagged wildly, faster than she had ever seen an animal's tail move. It looked at her, then looked around as if to ensure that Karen was indeed its target. Its eyes were filled with a kind of panic that wasn't typical of an animal simply looking for attention. This was different. This dog was searching for something, or someone, and for reasons Karen couldn't yet understand, that someone was her. Without hesitation, the dog darted forward, its little teeth grabbing at the hem of Karen's pant leg, tugging at it with surprising strength for such a small creature. The dog didn't bark this time. It didn't need to. The action was enough to send a clear message: follow me. Karen froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had never been in a situation quite like this, one where an animal so clearly depended on her for something more than just help with a simple issue. Most people would have laughed it off, shrugged and walked away. But Karen wasn't most people. She had spent years learning how to listen to her instincts, and right now, her instincts were screaming at her to take this seriously. The dog's tugging was no ordinary behavior. It was urgent and filled with intent. The kind of urgency you felt in your gut when something dangerous or alarming was just around the corner. "Hey, easy there, little guy," Karen murmured as she crouched down, her hand instinctively reaching for the dog, her palm open in a gesture of calm. She could feel her pulse quickening, her mind already racing with possibilities, even as the dog continued to pull at her pant leg. "What's going on?" The dog looked up at her with those large, pleading eyes, a soft whine escaping its throat. It didn't seem to want her attention, it wanted her action. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure no one else was in the immediate vicinity, Karen stood up, her instincts kicking into overdrive. There was something far more serious happening here than she could have anticipated. This dog had led her to this very point for a reason, and she wasn't about to ignore it. The dog tugged again, pulling her forward with enough strength to suggest that it wasn't just aimlessly wandering, it was on a mission. Karen's feet moved on their own as if guided by the dog's urgency. She found herself following it down the sidewalk, the animal dashing ahead before looking back over its shoulder to ensure she was still in tow. The sun was now fully up, and the city streets had grown busier, the ordinary rhythm of the morning slowly taking hold again. But for Karen, the world around her seemed to fade into the background as her attention remained fixed on the dog. The tail wagged with every few steps, and the small body moved with surprising determination, darting through pedestrians and weaving between parked cars. Something about the dog's behavior made Karen feel like she was part of a scene from a thriller. This wasn't just an average patrol. This was something much bigger, something that was drawing her deeper into a situation that was yet to reveal its true nature. The dog led her into an alleyway, a narrow, quiet street that seemed to serve as a shortcut for people and deliveries. It was quieter here, the sounds of the city almost entirely muted, save for the soft tap-tap of the dog's paws on the concrete. The dog's pace didn't slow, and Karen followed without question, her senses heightened now as she tried to prepare herself for whatever might come next. The alley was lined with old brick buildings, their faces weathered by years of use and neglect. The garbage cans on the sides of the street were overflowing, their contents scattered across the pavement, adding a layer of grit to the otherwise sterile environment. There were no sounds of traffic, no voices of pedestrians, just the dog's excited barks and Karen's steady footsteps behind it.
As they neared the end of the alley, the dog suddenly veered to the right, running toward a rusted, half-open gate that marked the entrance to an abandoned construction site. The dog stopped just before the gate, its head turning back to look at Karen with an almost knowing gaze, as if to say, "This is where you need to be." Karen's stomach tightened. She wasn't sure why, but something about this place felt wrong. The abandoned site was silent, eerily so. The bones of a skeletal building loomed ahead, the unfinished framework casting long shadows across the litter-strewn ground. The site, once filled with the sound of construction, now stood still and forgotten. As she approached the gate, Karen's instincts told her that this was not a random detour. The dog wasn't just leading her to an empty lot. This was the moment where everything would change. This was the beginning of something far more complicated, something Karen wasn't prepared for, but was now undeniably a part of. The dog stood at the gate, its eyes locked on Karen, waiting. Its tail wagged once more, a silent invitation to cross the threshold. With a final glance at the busy streets she had left behind, Karen stepped forward, pushing open the gate. The creak of the rusted metal was deafening in the stillness, and as the dog trotted, Karen hesitated for just a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what lay beyond that gate, no idea why this dog had come for her. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary stray. This dog had led her to something, and she couldn't turn back now. Ahead, Karen followed, ready to face whatever would come next. As Karen stepped through the rusted gate, a sudden wave of unease swept over her. The dog, its tail still wagging with purpose, moved ahead with steady confidence, as if it had been here before, guiding her deeper into the forgotten heart of the construction site. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was different. It was more than just a stray dog acting a little out of the ordinary. It felt intentional. There was a clear urgency to its actions, a silent plea that she couldn't ignore. She felt the weight of that plea settle in her chest, her breath becoming shallower as the growing sense of danger made her pulse quicken. The site was eerily quiet, and Karen could feel her senses heightening with each step she took. The usual noise of the city seemed to have completely vanished, leaving only the faint echo of her boots against the cracked pavement and the distant rustle of the wind through the skeletal remains of the construction site. The tall steel beams of what was meant to be a new building loomed over her like dark sentinels, casting long shadows over the debris-filled ground. Old wooden planks, discarded tools, and twisted metal scraps lay scattered around, remnants of a project long abandoned. She felt a pang of discomfort at the silence. Oak Ridge, for all its hustle and bustle, was never a quiet city. There was always some noise: car horns, chattering pedestrians, the hum of the local businesses, the everyday sounds of life. But here, in this empty space, there was nothing. No distant voices, no sounds of construction. It was as if the city itself had intentionally kept its distance from this place. And now, Karen found herself standing at the threshold of something that felt utterly out of place. A forgotten corner of Oak Ridge that seemed to exist in its own isolated world. In the air, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively placed her hand closer to the holster on her belt, her fingers brushing against the comforting weight of her sidearm. Her training kicked in, and Karen was reminded of the countless situations where her instincts had kept her safe. Moments where she had relied on her gut to guide her, rather than any rational thought. And right now, every fiber of her being was telling her that she needed to proceed with caution. The dog, seemingly undeterred by the growing silence and the looming structures around them, continued its path forward. Karen followed, every step measured and deliberate, her senses working in overdrive as she scanned the surroundings for any signs of movement or danger. The dog stopped in front of a large stack of wooden planks, its sharp bark cutting through the stillness once more. The sound echoed through the site, but no response followed. No other sounds emerged from the shadows of the buildings. Still, Karen felt the unease settle deeper in her chest. "Stay sharp," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. The air felt thick now, almost oppressive, as if the very ground beneath her feet was holding its breath. The dog, however, didn't hesitate. It began pawing at the stack of planks, scratching and tugging at the edges with determination. Karen could see the animal's urgency, It wasn't playing or acting out of curiosity. It was trying to tell her something. The dog's eyes were wide with that same desperate intensity, its tail wagging, but not in a playful way. It was more like a signal, a frantic signal, urging her to understand.
Without thinking, Karen crouched down beside the dog, her eyes flicking between its movements and the stack of debris in front of them. She could see the faint outline of something beneath the wood, but it wasn't until she took a deeper breath that she realized what it was, a small, pale hand, barely visible amidst the shadows. It was almost too still, too lifeless to be real. Her heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes widened. A faint sound reached her ears, something between a groan and a gasp. It was weak, barely audible, but it was enough to make her pulse spike. She could feel the blood rushing to her ears as she reached forward, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed aside the first few pieces of wood. The dog's presence was a strange comfort, its low whimpers and pacing reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. There was something, or someone, here that needed her help. "Can you hear me?" Karen called softly, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts swirling in her head. She cleared more of the wood away, inching closer to the trapped figure. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest as her eyes made contact with the faintest hint of a face. A child, no older than 8 or 9, lay beneath the rubble, his small frame partially hidden beneath the debris. His face was streaked with dirt, and his eyes fluttered open, locking onto hers with an expression that combined confusion, fear, and the slightest flicker of hope. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. A child, alone and trapped, hidden away in the middle of an abandoned construction site. It wasn't just a random accident, this was far from ordinary. Karen's mind raced, her instincts working overtime to process the situation. The dog, the urgency, the eerie quiet of the site, all of it was leading her to this moment. Someone had left this child here, and the sight of him, battered and alone, only deepened the growing pit in Karen's stomach. The dog, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, paused its frantic movements and sat down beside Karen. Its eyes remained locked on the boy, a silent protector in this strange, unfolding scene. Karen's heart swelled for a moment at the sight of the dog's unwavering loyalty, but her thoughts snapped back to the task at hand. The child needed immediate help, and there was no time to waste. "Hang in there, sweetheart," Karen said softly, her voice trying to calm both herself and the child. She could feel her pulse hammering in her chest as she continued to clear the debris away. "I'm here now. You're going to be okay." The boy's eyes flickered with recognition, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. His voice was weak, barely a whisper. "The bad men. They were chasing me," he managed to stammer, his words coming out in broken bursts. "I hid, but the wood, it fell." Karen's heart sank as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The boy had been running, hiding from something, and somehow, it had brought him to this abandoned site. Whoever those bad men were, they had left a child alone in a dangerous place. And they were still out there. Karen's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the situation. "Don't worry," Karen reassured him, her voice firm, despite the growing fear that tightened her chest. "We're going to get you out of here. Just hold on, okay?" The dog's eyes remained vigilant, watching Karen's every move as she continued to clear away the debris, the silence of the construction site now replaced by the sound of her efforts and the dog's quiet whines. She could feel the weight of the moment settle over her. This was no accident. This was a setup, a trap, and whoever had put this child in danger was still out there, watching. As Karen carefully removed the last few pieces of wood, she reached down and gently lifted the boy into her arms. His frail body felt cold, but his eyes were filled with trust, as if he knew that Karen was there to protect him. And in that moment, Karen's instincts sharpened with a new sense of clarity. This wasn't just about saving a child. This was about stopping something far more sinister from continuing. As Karen continued to clear the debris, her thoughts were racing. The urgency of the situation, the dog's strange behavior, and now, the boy's fragile state, everything seemed to be building toward a larger, more sinister story than she could have anticipated. The construction site was eerily silent, its abandoned nature adding an unsettling weight to the already tense atmosphere. This place, once filled with the sounds of hammers and drills, now lay still, untouched, forgotten, as if the city had deliberately chosen to leave it behind. But as Karen's eyes scanned the scene, she realized there was nothing about this place that could have been a simple accident. This was deliberate. Her hand moved toward her sidearm, feeling the cool metal against her fingertips, a steady reminder of her training, even as her gut twisted with the realization that something far more dangerous than she had expected was unfolding before her. The boy's faint whispers echoed in her mind, "Bad men." The words played over and over again in her head, a reminder that whoever had left this child here, whoever had been chasing him, was still out there, and they were probably watching. As she stood up from the debris pile, Karen looked down at the small dog, still pacing nervously at her feet, its eyes glued to her, as if it had been waiting for her next move. The animal's presence seemed to steady her, a strange comfort in the midst of the tension that was beginning to consume the air around her. It was as if the dog understood the gravity of the situation and was silently urging her to keep moving forward, to follow it wherever it was leading her. The dog, without any hesitation, began moving toward the center of the construction site. It trotted ahead with purpose, its body tense, ears perked, as if it were on a mission. Karen hesitated for only a moment before she followed, the sense of unease growing within her with every step. The dog led her deeper into the site, weaving through the scattered piles of debris, around rusted metal beams, and past the crumbling remnants of the construction equipment that had once been used to build what was meant to be a thriving structure. The scene before her looked like a ghost town, frozen in time, a reminder of a project that had started with promise, only to be abandoned halfway through. The further they went, the more isolated the place felt. The sound of the city, now a distant hum in the background, was swallowed up by the abandoned site's oppressive silence. Karen's footsteps seemed too loud now, the only sound cutting through the stillness. Her eyes darted around as she scanned the area, alert for any signs of movement or danger. And then, as the dog paused at a large, half-dismantled pile of concrete slabs and twisted steel, Karen noticed something that immediately caught her attention, a faint trail of blood, barely visible against the gray concrete floor. It was a thin, almost imperceptible line at first, but as her eyes followed it, the trail began to become clearer, leading further into the site. Karen's stomach lurched at the sight. The blood was fresh. It wasn't just a small scrape or a cut, it was evidence of something far more serious. And this wasn't just any random spill, it was as if someone had tried to drag themselves along, leaving a faint mark of their blood behind, struggling to move but unable to escape the scene. The dog, ever alert, continued to look back at her, urging her forward. It was as if it knew exactly where to go, leading Karen step by step through the silent labyrinth of the construction site. Each new discovery, the trail of blood, the abandoned equipment, the haunting emptiness of the place, was adding to the growing feeling that this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about a lost child and a desperate dog. Something much darker was at play, and Karen was about to uncover the terrifying truth. Without thinking, Karen reached for her radio. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "This is Officer Mitchell. I'm at the abandoned construction site off Maple Avenue. I need immediate backup. There's a trail of blood, and it looks fresh. I need forensics and medical assistance." She paused for a moment, scanning the surroundings, her hand still resting on the radio. "This is not just an accident. We may have a crime scene here." Her radio crackled back to life, the voice of dispatch coming through. "Copy that, Officer Mitchell. Backup and forensics are on the way. Stay on the line and stay safe." Karen nodded, though she knew no one could hear her. She turned her attention back to the dog, whose alert posture seemed to encourage her to continue moving forward. The trail of blood twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the heart of the construction site, where the skeletal remains of the unfinished building loomed overhead. The air was thick with dust, the kind that seemed to settle on everything, covering even the smallest of details. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating, as though the site itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The further Karen followed the blood trail, the more it became clear that someone had been in a hurry to escape. The path was jagged, as though whoever had left it had been stumbling, trying to make their way through the debris, leaving a trail of blood behind them as they went. The dog had led her here, led her to this abandoned corner of Oak Ridge, where the echoes of the city were replaced by the shadows of something far more sinister. The dog stopped abruptly at a pile of rubble in the middle of the site, its nose pressed to the ground. It was as if the animal had reached its destination. Karen knelt down beside it, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The blood trail led directly to the pile, and beneath the debris, there was something that didn't belong. As she began to clear away the broken pieces of wood and metal, she could feel her heart rate pick up again. There was something underneath, something hidden. Her hands trembled slightly, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her. This wasn't just an abandoned site. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was carefully orchestrated, and she had just stumbled upon the aftermath of something far worse than she had ever imagined. The dog's low whine echoed through the site as Karen cleared more of the debris away. And then, as the final pieces of wood were moved, Karen's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the rubble, partially covered in dust and dirt, was a small hand, pale, lifeless, and only partially visible. It was as though someone had tried to hide it, to bury it, but in the end, the truth had been left behind. A child, no older than 8 or 9, was trapped beneath the wreckage, the blood trail leading to this very spot. Karen's hands shook as she reached for the child, her mind racing as she processed what she was seeing. The situation had escalated in a way she hadn't prepared for. It wasn't just about a missing child anymore. It was about a cover-up, a crime that had been carefully hidden in plain sight. The dog, still by her side, barked once, loudly and sharply, seemingly alerting Karen to the danger. The time for caution had passed. They were no longer in the realm of simple police work. Karen was about to uncover something much darker, something that would put both her and the child's life at risk. The pile of debris in front of Karen felt heavier than it should. Each piece she moved seemed to add more weight to the growing uncertainty in her chest. Her hands, though steady from years of training, trembled slightly as she cleared away the broken planks and twisted metal, the sharp edges scraping against her gloves. With each inch of the rubble she moved, her sense of urgency grew. The dog, still at her side, watched intently, its body low and tense, as if it too understood the gravity of the situation. The quiet urgency of its presence made Karen feel more focused, more determined to reach whoever, was beneath the wreckage. The silence of the construction site hung thick in the air, interrupted only by the occasional scrape of metal and the quiet rustle of the dog's fur as it paced around her. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching longer as Karen's mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this child? Why was he here? Why was he left alone in such a dangerous place? The questions echoed in her mind, but for now, they had to wait. She couldn't afford to waste time pondering. Not now. And then, her hand brushed against something solid, a small yet unmistakable weight under the debris. It was a hand, pale, small, and lifeless, partially buried under the twisted remnants of the construction site. Karen's breath caught in her throat as her heart pounded in her ears. She paused for a moment, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't just a hand. It was attached to a small arm, and as she cleared away more of the debris, Karen's stomach tightened. The form of a child slowly became visible beneath the wreckage. A chill ran down her spine. The child was pale, his body covered in dirt and dust, and there were streaks of blood staining his clothes. His small face was pressed against the concrete, his limbs twisted awkwardly under the weight of the debris. Despite his fragile appearance, there was a faint rise and fall of his chest, a weak but undeniable sign of life. He was still breathing, but only just. Karen felt her heart tighten with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that every second counted. She had no idea how long the boy had been trapped under the rubble, but she could feel the urgency in the pit of her stomach. He was running out of time. She reached down with both hands, carefully lifting the debris from around the child's fragile form. Each movement was cautious, calculated. She couldn't risk hurting him more than he already was. The dog, ever loyal, stood by her side, its eyes locked onto the boy, its presence an anchor for Karen's racing thoughts. The dog barked once, sharply, its voice breaking the oppressive silence of the site. It was as if the animal knew that the child's life depended on her actions, urging her to act quickly. Karen could feel the dog's unspoken message, and without wasting another moment, she redoubled her efforts. She gently cleared more of the wood, the twisted metal, and the broken concrete, feeling the weight of the debris lift slightly with each piece she moved. As the last of the rubble shifted, Karen finally uncovered the child's face completely. His eyes fluttered open, weakly, as he struggled to make sense of the world around him. For a moment, Karen just stared at him, her heart breaking at the sight of his vulnerability. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his small body shivering from the cold and the shock. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her believe that he knew he was not alone anymore. He was going to be okay. The boy's lips trembled as he tried to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, help me," he muttered, his words coming out strained and fragile. The pain and exhaustion in his voice were unmistakable. He was so small, so fragile. Karen felt the weight of the situation deepen in that moment. This child had been left to fend for himself in a dangerous, abandoned site, his only companion a loyal dog who had led Karen straight to him. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Karen whispered, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe now. I'm here." She placed one hand gently on his shoulder, careful not to cause him further distress. The dog, still by her side, gave a soft whimper, almost as if it were reassuring the boy too. It was a sound that spoke of loyalty, of trust, of a bond that ran deeper than just a human and an animal. In that moment, the dog seemed like the boy's protector, his guardian angel. And now, Karen was part of that promise of safety. As she continued to lift the debris, she noticed something that made her pause for a moment, a faint trail of blood leading from the boy's side. The boy had been injured more severely than she had first realized. Her heart sank as she realized that the blood wasn't just from the rubble. Something more had happened here. Whoever had left this child in such a state had caused far more harm than just a simple accident. "Karen, can you hear me?" The voice crackled through her radio, pulling her back to the present. She had forgotten for a moment that she had already called for backup. The urgency in the voice was evident, and Karen responded, her words steady despite the fear and adrenaline coursing through her. "I've found the boy," Karen said quickly, her voice laced with urgency. "He's alive, but he's badly injured. We need immediate medical assistance here. He's been trapped under the debris. The blood trail leads back further into the site. This may not have been an accident." The voice on the other end responded quickly, confirming that help was on the way. But Karen knew that every second counted. She couldn't wait for backup to arrive. She needed to act now. The dog, still pacing around the boy, gave a soft bark, as though it was urging Karen to hurry. Karen's heart swelled with gratitude for the little animal's loyalty, but she knew she couldn't waste any more time. She gently scooped the boy into her arms, being careful to support his injured body as she stood, the child's small form barely fitting in her embrace. She could feel his breath, shallow but steady, against her chest as she carried him, her heart hammering in her chest with the weight of what was happening. The boy's eyes fluttered closed as she began to make her way back through the construction site, the dog following closely behind, its presence a silent promise that Karen wouldn't have to face this alone. As she made her way toward the gate, the sense of urgency grew even stronger. The boy was fading, his body too weak to endure the strain of being trapped for so long. She could only hope that help would arrive in time, that the dog's desperate actions would lead to a miracle. But deep down, Karen knew that this was just the beginning. Whoever had left the boy here, whoever had done this to him, was still out there, and she was going to find them. Karen's heart raced as she carefully made her way back through the construction site, the boy, Leo, in her arms. His body felt impossibly small and fragile, his weight almost weightless as she held him against her chest, but his breathing was shallow, his pulse faint. The blood that stained his clothes and the bruises on his face only served to heighten the urgency of the situation. Each step Karen took felt heavier than the last, her mind constantly weighing the fear of losing him against the hope that the paramedics would arrive in time to save him. As she neared the rusted gate that led out of the construction site, the dog trotted beside her, its steps mirroring hers with surprising precision. It was as if the little animal understood the gravity of the situation, keeping pace and offering its silent companionship in a way that made Karen feel slightly less alone. Despite the fear racing through her veins, there was something calming about the dog's presence, its steady gaze reminding her that she wasn't alone in this rescue. The gate loomed ahead of them, and Karen's steps grew faster as the sight of the open street beckoned. She couldn't shake the image of the boy, so small, so vulnerable, trapped in that sight. Her heart clenched with the unspoken fear of what would have happened if she hadn't been there to intervene, if the dog hadn't led her to him. But they were almost there, just a few more steps, and then she could get him the medical attention he so desperately needed. As she crossed through the gate and into the daylight, the dog gave one final, insistent bark, as if it were signaling the end of its mission. Karen paused, looking down at Leo, his pale face tucked into her jacket. His eyelids fluttered, but he seemed too weak to speak. His body shivered slightly, a soft whimper escaping from his lips. "Leo, can you hear me?" Karen asked softly, her voice laced with concern. The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, his pupils dilated as he tried to focus on her. His lips parted, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was going to speak. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down Karen's spine. "They were chasing me," he whispered, his words strained and weak. "The bad men, they were chasing me. I ran. But they kept coming after me." Karen's heart tightened as she carefully adjusted her grip on him, kneeling down to bring her face closer to his. She could see the fear in his eyes, the panic that had driven him to hide in that abandoned construction site. Whoever these bad men were, Leo had been running for his life. "Leo, you're safe now," Karen reassured him, trying to keep her voice calm despite the flood of emotions rushing through her. "Can you tell me more? What happened? Who were the bad men?" Leo closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to continue. His small fingers gripped the sleeve of Karen's jacket, and he gave a soft shiver, his body betraying the trauma he had endured. They kept saying bad things," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "They wanted me, but I ran away. I didn't know where to go. I was so scared." Karen's heart broke for him. The boy had been alone, scared, and pursued by people who meant him harm. Whoever these men were, they weren't just ordinary criminals. They were dangerous. And they had left a young child alone to fend for himself in the middle of an abandoned site. The dog, who had been silently pacing nearby, now sat down beside Leo, its head resting on its paws, its eyes never leaving the boy. It was as though the animal knew exactly what Leo needed, a sense of safety, reassurance that things were going to be okay. Karen smiled softly at the dog, her heart swelling with gratitude for its loyalty. The bond between the two was undeniable, and in that moment, Karen could see how much the dog had meant to Leo during his ordeal. It wasn't just a pet, it was his protector. "Did they hurt you, Leo?" Karen asked gently, her voice full of concern. The last thing she wanted was to make him relive his fear, but she needed to know the full extent of the danger he had faced. The truth could help her understand why these men were after him, and perhaps lead her to a way to stop them. Leo's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and reluctance as he spoke. They hurt me," he said, his voice breaking. "But I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't stop. I hid here." He paused, his face contorting with a mix of pain and exhaustion. I thought they were going to take me away. I don't want to go with them." Karen felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. No child should have to go through what Leo had endured. No one should ever have to live in fear like that, especially not a child as young as him. The thought of these bad men chasing him, scarring him, made her stomach turn. Whoever they were, they had a lot to answer for. "Leo, you did the right thing," Karen said, her voice steady but full of warmth. She reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You're safe now. The bad men can't hurt you anymore. We're going to make sure of that." Leo nodded weakly, his eyes fluttering closed as the exhaustion from his ordeal began to take its toll. He was barely holding on to consciousness, and Karen could see how fragile he was, physically and emotionally. It was clear that this little boy had been through more than any child should ever have to endure. And yet, here he was, still alive, still fighting, thanks to the dog and to her. The faint sound of sirens in the distance broke through the tension of the moment. Karen's eyes flicked toward the sound, relieved that help was finally on its way. She could see the flashing lights of the ambulances approaching, the paramedics ready to tend to Leo's injuries and get him to safety. But as the sirens grew louder, Karen's thoughts shifted back to the bad men Leo had mentioned. Who were they? What did they want with a child like him? And why had they been so relentless in their pursuit? As the paramedics arrived, Karen gently handed Leo over to them, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was far from over. She still didn't know the full story. She didn't know who was behind this, or why they had targeted Leo. But one thing was certain, the boy had been through something horrific, and now, it was Karen's mission to find out what had happened and make sure it never happened again. As the ambulance doors closed and Leo was whisked away to the hospital, Karen turned back to the dog, who was sitting quietly at her feet. Its loyalty to Leo, its role in leading her to the child, had not gone unnoticed. The bond between them was real, and the dog's mission wasn't over either. It had helped save Leo's life, but now it was up to Karen to finish what they had started. She looked at the dog, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We're not done yet, are we, buddy?" she murmured. The dog's tail wagged once, as if in agreement. No, they weren't done. Not by a long shot. As the ambulance carrying Leo sped off toward the hospital, Karen stood frozen for a moment, watching the flashing lights disappear down the street. The air seemed to settle around her, but her mind was anything but still. She could still hear the echoes of Leo's whispered words in her head. The bad men were chasing me. The fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, and the haunting way he described the chase. It all pointed to something far darker than she could have imagined. Karen's instincts told her that there was more to this than just a simple case of a missing child or an isolated incident. Whoever these bad men were, they were connected to something bigger, something organized. But the puzzle pieces were still scattered. Leo had run, and he had hidden, but the real question still lingered. Why were they after him? What did they want from him? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, someone, important waiting to be found. Leo's family, his mother, they were the key to understanding why this had all happened. Karen took a deep breath, forcing herself to refocus. There was no time to waste. As much as her mind raced with the questions about Leo's abduction, she knew she had to act quickly. She needed to find Leo's family, make sure they were safe, and give them the reassurance that their son was alive and well, before whoever had been chasing him could get to them. She turned back toward the construction site, the dog still loyally at her side, as though it had never left. She began to scan the area more methodically now, her eyes searching for anything that could give her more clues about Leo's background, about his life before he had been abandoned in the wreckage of the site. Something in her gut told her that the boy had not just been randomly placed here. This was personal. These people, whoever they were, had been following him, tracking him. As Karen moved toward the spot where she had first found Leo, her foot brushed against something solid buried beneath the rubble. She knelt down and cleared away a few more pieces of debris, her fingers brushing against a familiar, worn object, a small, gray backpack. It was covered in dirt, its zipper slightly open, as if someone had been in a hurry to leave it behind. The dog, ever vigilant, sat by her side, its gaze fixed on the bag as if it understood the importance of the discovery. Karen picked up the backpack, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It wasn't much, but in this case, anything could be a clue. She unzipped it carefully, afraid of disturbing anything that might be inside, and pulled out the first item, a small notebook, its pages well worn from use. She flipped through it quickly, seeing sketches of a family, a man, a woman, and a little boy who looked remarkably like Leo. The drawings were crude, yet there was a tenderness in them. The boy, it seemed, had been trying to hold on to something normal in the midst of all the chaos, trying to capture memories of a life before the darkness had descended upon him. Karen's eyes softened as she looked at the drawings. This wasn't just a child who had been running from danger. This was a child who had been clinging to the only thing that made sense to him, his family. The thought that someone could put a child through this, force him to run for his life, broke her heart. But there was more to find. She reached deeper into the bag and pulled out a water bottle, a few snacks, and then, at the very bottom, a small slip of paper. It was a phone number, handwritten in shaky, desperate handwriting. The ink was smudged in a few places, likely from exposure to rain or the wear and tear of being carried around in the boy's bag. But the phone number was clear enough. Karen held the paper in her hand for a moment, contemplating the next steps. This was a lead, a vital one. She had to contact this person, whoever they were, and find out if they were connected to Leo's family. She reached for her radio, making the call that she knew she had to make. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I've found a phone number in a backpack that belongs to Leo, the boy I just rescued. I need you to trace it, get me in touch with the family as soon as possible." The voice from dispatch responded quickly. "Copy that, Officer Mitchell. We'll get the number traced and contact the family immediately." Karen tucked the slip of paper into her pocket, feeling a slight weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something to give her the direction she needed. As she turned away from the construction site, the dog trotted at her side, still ever present, guiding her, just as it had done all along. There was no doubt in Karen's mind that this dog knew more about this situation than it was letting on. But for now, her focus had to be on the next steps. She needed to get to Leo's family. Just as she began walking toward her patrol car, her phone rang. She answered it immediately, her heart racing with anticipation. "Hello, Officer Mitchell." The voice on the other end was shaky, but relieved. "This is Sarah Evans. Is my son okay? Is he with you?" Karen's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and emotion. She had found Leo's mother, and now, she could bring the news that Leo was alive. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Karen Mitchell. Your son, Leo, is safe now. He's been through a lot, but he's going to be all right. He's being taken to the hospital for treatment, and I'll make sure you're there with him. But I need to ask you a few things. Can you tell me what happened? Who is after your son?" Sarah's voice wavered with emotion. I don't know. I thought we were safe. After Leo's father left, I thought we were far enough away from all that. But something has happened, hasn't it? Please tell me Leo is okay. Karen's voice softened, and she reassured Sarah once more. He's safe now, ma'am, but I need to know more. You mentioned Leo's father. Can you tell me if he had any connections to dangerous people? Did he have any enemies? Anything that might explain why Leo was being chased? Sarah was silent for a moment, as though collecting her thoughts, trying to process the whirlwind of questions and emotions that were rushing at her. Finally, she spoke, her voice breaking. My ex-husband, he got involved with some dangerous people. I didn't know the full extent of it, but I found out later. We got out, Leo and I, but I guess they found us anyway. Karen's stomach churned with the realization of the scale of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about a child in danger, it was about a larger, organized operation. And whoever these people were, they weren't just after Leo. They were after something his family had been hiding. Ma'am, I'll get you to Leo, but please, stay at the hospital. It's not safe for you to be alone right now. We're going to protect you both, I promise. Sarah's voice trembled with relief, but the underlying fear still remained. Thank you, Officer Mitchell. I don't know what we would have done without you. Karen ended the call, her mind already working through the next steps. She had found Leo's mother, but the investigation was just beginning. The truth behind the bad men Leo had spoken about was still out there, and Karen was determined to bring them to justice, to ensure that no more families had to live in fear. As Karen got into her patrol car, the dog hopped into the back seat, sitting quietly, its eyes locked on her. There was still so much to uncover, so many questions unanswered. But now, for the first time, Karen felt like she had a lead, a path forward. She could only hope that this lead would bring them closer to the truth. As Karen prepared to leave the construction site and head to the hospital to check on Leo, a strange feeling prickled the back of her neck. The air, still heavy with the tension of the rescue, seemed to shift ever so slightly. It wasn't the usual post-rescue exhaustion that she felt, it was a sense of being watched, as if someone was quietly observing her every move. It was a sensation she had learned to trust over the years, an instinct that told her when something wasn't quite right. The dog, which had been silently sitting at her side, suddenly shifted its weight, its body tense. Its eyes, always so focused, narrowed slightly as it lifted its head and began to survey the surroundings with increased vigilance. Karen's gaze followed the dog's, and her pulse quickened when she noticed a figure standing near the edge of the construction site, partly obscured by the shadows of a nearby pile of steel beams. The figure was a man, his posture relaxed, but there was something about his stance that immediately set off alarms in Karen's mind. He was standing at a distance, but his eyes were unmistakably locked on her, the kind of gaze that felt deliberate, almost invasive. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap, but there was no mistaking the intensity with which he observed the scene unfolding in front of him. Karen's eyes narrowed, instinctively stepping closer to the patrol car, her hand drifting toward her weapon as her senses went into overdrive. Something about this man didn't sit right with her, and she couldn't shake the growing suspicion that he had been there for far longer than she had realized. The dog's growls were low, a soft rumble from deep within its chest that was a clear signal of discomfort. Karen knew that animals had a way of sensing things that humans often missed, and the dog's behavior only made her more suspicious. She was no stranger to this kind of feeling, the feeling of being watched, of being on the verge of uncovering something dangerous. And right now, the man in front of her was the focal point of that danger. She subtly signaled to her partner, who had been standing near the patrol car, keeping an eye on the scene. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the city. "I'm going to check something out." With her hand still resting lightly on the holster of her sidearm, Karen started to move in the direction of the mysterious man, her eyes never leaving him. As she walked toward him, she kept her movements deliberate and calm, trying not to alert him to her growing suspicion. She was a seasoned officer, trained to handle situations like this. But something about this felt different, and that difference was enough to make her take extra caution. The man stood still, his face unreadable, though Karen could tell he was aware of her approach. He didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of surprise or nervousness, just a cold, steady gaze that seemed to hold a message she couldn't decipher. As she closed the distance, Karen's mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this man? Why was he here? And more importantly, what did he want? When she was only a few feet away from him, Karen stopped, standing her ground and carefully observing his every movement. She was close enough now to get a better look at him. He was tall, with dark clothes that blended into the shadows, and a face that seemed both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. His features were sharp, his jaw clenched, and there was a hardness to his eyes, a coldness that sent a chill through her spine. He wasn't someone who belonged in this part of town, not unless he had a reason to be here. And Karen was certain that his reason had everything to do with the chaos that had unfolded. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her voice steady but firm, cutting through the silence that had hung between them like an invisible thread. Her fingers curled around the grip of her sidearm as she prepared herself for any potential threat, though she hoped she wouldn't have to use it. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, though there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that made Karen's skin crawl, one that spoke of knowledge and intent. "I'm just a bystander," he replied smoothly, his voice low and even. "Just observing the situation." "Observing?" Karen repeated, her tone skeptical. "You've been standing there for a while now, and I don't recall seeing you when I first arrived." She took another step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "What's your name?" The man's smile never wavered, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that told Karen he wasn't going to make this easy. "I'm just a curious person, officer." "No harm in that, is there?" Karen's gaze hardened. She had heard that kind of response before, cryptic, evasive, and dripping with an undercurrent of something more sinister. She knew this game, and she wasn't going to play it. "I don't like being watched," she said coldly. "And I don't like being lied to." The man's smile faded, and for the briefest of moments, Karen could see a flash of something else in his eyes, something darker, more dangerous. He stepped back slightly, but not enough to make it seem like he was intimidated. Instead, it was more like he was positioning himself, preparing for something. "I'm not the one you need to be worried about, officer," he said quietly, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. "But you're already in over your head. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just some random bystander. This man knew something. He was connected to whatever had brought Leo to the construction site. His words carried a warning, and Karen had no intention of ignoring it. She took another step forward, her stance widening, her hand still resting on her weapon. "You're not going anywhere until I get some answers," Karen said firmly, her voice filled with authority. The man didn't flinch, but there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps. A slight hesitation that told Karen he wasn't entirely sure how this encounter would play out. He glanced over his shoulder quickly, almost as if checking for someone, before he turned back to her. "Just remember, officer," he said, his tone now tinged with cold menace, "you don't know who you're up against. This," he gestured vaguely toward the construction site, "this is just the beginning." With that, he turned abruptly, walking away from her without another word. Karen watched him carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't about to let him get away, not without understanding exactly who he was. But as she moved toward him, she stopped in her tracks. The mysterious man disappeared into the shadows of the alley, blending seamlessly with the night. And just like that, he was gone, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Karen stood there for a moment, the silence of the street pressing in on her. The dog, still by her side, let out a low whine, as if sensing her unease. She had tried to confront him, to get answers, but all he had left her with was more questions. The man's cryptic words lingered in her mind. This is just the beginning. What did he mean? And how was he connected to the bad men Leo had spoken of? The answers were slipping further out of reach, but Karen knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Whoever this man was, and whatever he was involved in, Karen was now part of something far bigger than she had imagined. Karen stood silently for a moment, her eyes locked on the spot where the mysterious man had disappeared into the shadows. The city had returned to its usual hum, cars passing by, people talking, the hum of the distant streets, but for Karen, the events of the past hour felt like a dream, too surreal to fully grasp. The man's cryptic words, "This is just the beginning," echoed in her mind, a constant reminder that the situation was much larger and more dangerous than she had originally thought. The air around her seemed to thicken, her body still tense as the adrenaline of the rescue began to ebb, leaving behind a cold sense of urgency. She had to understand what was really happening. She had to know who these bad men were, why they were after Leo, and why they had left him to die in the debris of an abandoned construction site. The pieces of this puzzle were starting to form, but they were incomplete, blurry fragments that refused to make sense on their own. She needed more. With a heavy sigh, Karen turned back toward the construction site. She had already called for backup, but she knew she needed to return to the place where it had all started. The dog, ever faithful, trotted beside her, its posture alert, as if it too knew that the answers lay in the place they had just left. The site was silent now, the only sound being the distant noise of the city behind her. As she pushed open the rusted gate again, the same uneasy feeling that had gripped her earlier settled back into her chest. The site, abandoned and filled with debris, seemed unchanged since the last time she had been there. But it felt different now, heavier, somehow. It was as if the silence of the place had been holding something back, something that only she, as an officer of the law, could uncover. The dog, trailing behind her, sniffed the air as if it had already marked this place as its domain, its instincts sharp as it moved cautiously through the littered ground. Karen began her search methodically, moving from one end of the site to the other, carefully inspecting every pile of debris, every overturned piece of wood and steel. There was no sign of the mysterious man, no trace of the danger that had lurked only moments before. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something was being concealed here, something more than just a child's fear. As she moved past a stack of old wooden planks, something caught her eye, a flash of metal reflecting the light of the setting sun. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat as she knelt down to inspect the object. It was a key, a small, battered metal key, its surface worn smooth from use. It didn't belong in a place like this. Karen picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hand, noting the strange number etched into its side, 312. The key felt cold against her skin, its significance not yet clear, but Karen knew this was something important. Her gut told her that the key wasn't just a random piece of debris, it was connected to the mystery unfolding before her. She tucked it into her pocket, making a mental note to follow up on its meaning later. There were no immediate clues as to what the key opened, but something told her it was part of a much larger operation. A trail was beginning to form, and Karen had to follow it, no matter where it led. As she continued to search, moving toward a pile of discarded metal beams, her eyes caught sight of something else, something small, nearly hidden beneath a layer of dirt and dust. She crouched down, brushing the debris away with her gloved hands, and uncovered a small scrap of fabric. It was dark, coarse, and ripped at the edges as though it had been torn in a struggle. It didn't look like it belonged to any of the construction materials around her. No, this was something else, something personal. A piece of clothing, perhaps, from one of the people involved in whatever was happening here. Karen carefully examined the fabric. It was dark, almost like the material of a work jacket. The texture was rough, and as she held it up to the light, she could see a faint trace of something else on it: dirt, grease, maybe even blood. The fabric had been through something, perhaps a violent altercation, something that had left it stained and torn. Karen bagged it for evidence, knowing that this scrap, however small, could be a key piece in understanding what had gone down at this construction site. The pieces were starting to come together, but Karen knew she needed more. The key, the fabric, the blood trail, it all pointed to something bigger. There was a larger operation at play here, one that involved not just a missing child but possibly a network of criminals operating in the shadows. And whoever they were, they had been here. They had left their mark on this site, and they had left Leo in their wake. The dog, still at her side, let out a soft bark, as if it were urging her to keep moving. Karen straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands, her mind working through the clues. The dog had brought her here, guided her to the boy, and now it seemed to be guiding her toward the next step. The connection between Leo, his family, and these bad men was starting to take shape, but Karen needed to understand who was behind this and why they were so desperate to find Leo. Karen's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the setting sun was casting long shadows across the city. She had been here for hours, sifting through the pieces of a puzzle that was far bigger than she had imagined. But the pieces were still scattered, and they didn't fit together just yet. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to keep digging. The key and the fabric were just the beginning. The operation she was uncovering was more complex than she had ever imagined, and the people involved were far more dangerous than she had anticipated. But one thing was certain: Karen wasn't going to stop until she had the answers, until she had brought the people responsible to justice. And as she looked down at the dog, its eyes fixed on her with unwavering loyalty, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. The investigation was far from over, but Karen was getting closer. And this time, she would be ready for whatever came next. The weight of the key and the fabric scrap in her pocket felt heavier with each passing moment. Karen had been investigating Leo's case for hours now, piecing together fragments of information that seemed to fit together like a puzzle, but she wasn't any closer to understanding the full scope of what had happened. The construction site had been a key moment, but it felt like just the surface of something much darker lurking beneath. As much as she'd hoped the trail would lead her straight to the answers, she knew that this case was only just beginning. The real question remained: why was Leo being targeted? The only lead that had begun to make any sense was the mention of Leo's father. The small boy had said it himself: the bad men. They were chasing me. It wasn't a random statement. Leo had been running for his life, and whoever was after him had a connection to something, or someone, in his past. As she sat in her patrol car, the heat of the evening sun seeping through the windows, Karen found herself reflecting on the brief conversation she'd had with Leo's mother earlier. Sarah Evans had sounded shaken, but the words she spoke had lingered in Karen's mind like an echo, reverberating through the quiet stillness of the car. My ex-husband, he got involved with some dangerous people. I didn't know the full extent of it, but I found out later. We got out, Leo and I, but I guess they found us anyway. The more Karen thought about it, the more it made sense. Leo's father had been involved with people who had left a dark imprint on his family's life. It wasn't just about Leo. His father had likely been a target of this operation long before Leo had even come into the picture. And now, whatever had driven Leo's father to leave was pulling at the seams of his son's life. Karen's instincts told her that this was more than just an ordinary family feud or a case of a child caught in the crossfire of a personal dispute. No, this was deeper. This was organized, dangerous, and the thread that connected Leo's past to the present was starting to unravel. She knew she had to dig deeper, but how? She needed more information. And the best way to get that information was through Leo's mother. As much as Karen wanted to speak to her right away, she knew she had to be cautious. There was no telling how much Sarah knew, or if she even realized how deep her ex-husband's involvement really went. But one thing was clear: Sarah had been trying to protect Leo for years, and now she needed Karen's help to finish what had been started. Karen quickly grabbed her phone and dialed the number she had used earlier to contact Sarah. As the phone rang, she braced herself for what might come next. She had questions, hard questions, and she knew Sarah might not have all the answers. But she had to ask. There was no turning back now. "Hello?" Sarah's voice was still laced with tension, though it was softer now, a sense of relief in her tone from knowing Leo was safe. "Hi, Sarah. It's Karen. I hope you're holding up okay." Karen's voice was calm, trying to soothe the woman through the phone. "I'm trying," Sarah replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I just want to know he's okay. I've been through enough, Karen. I just need to know why this is happening." Karen nodded to herself, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "I know, Sarah, and I'm doing everything I can to find out. But there's something I need to ask you, something that might help me understand why Leo is being targeted. You said your ex-husband was involved with dangerous people. Can you tell me more about that? How deep was his involvement? Do you think it could be connected to all of this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence heavy with emotion. Karen could practically feel the weight of the years of pain and fear that Sarah had endured, the toll this past had taken on her. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "I didn't know the full story at first. My ex, his name was Jason. He wasn't always like this. When we were together, everything seemed fine. He worked a regular job, we had Leo, and life wasn't perfect, but it was stable." Her voice trembled slightly. "But then, after Leo was born, something changed. Jason started coming home late. He'd smell like smoke, like something burning. I thought maybe it was work, maybe he was getting involved in something dangerous, but I never imagined it was something like this." Sarah paused again, and Karen let her speak, not wanting to interrupt her. She could tell that Sarah was reliving a time she'd tried so hard to forget. Eventually, Jason started talking about people, about debts he owed. And then one night, he came home with blood on his shirt. That's when I knew something was wrong. He told me that it was the last time he'd deal with them, but I didn't believe him. I knew he was scared. So, I took Leo and left. We moved here to Oak Ridge, and I thought we were safe. Her voice cracked as she continued, "But now I think they've found us. These bad men, they must be the ones Jason was involved with. They're the reason Leo's in danger. I didn't want Leo to grow up in that life, Karen. I didn't want him to be part of that world." Karen's chest tightened with the weight of Sarah's words. It was clear now that Leo's father had been involved with a dangerous group, perhaps a gang, perhaps something larger. These were people who didn't just disappear, who didn't forgive easily. And now, they had turned their attention to Leo. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Karen said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "I know this isn't easy, but this is important. I need to know more about these people. If we can figure out who they are, I can make sure Leo stays safe, and I can stop them from hurting anyone else." Sarah's voice was faint, barely above a whisper. "I don't know much more, Karen. Jason never wanted me involved. But if you think it'll help, there's one thing I do remember. Jason, he kept a safe. It was at the house we used to live in. He said it was for important things, things he didn't want me or Leo to know about. I don't know if it's still there, but it could be worth looking into." Karen's heart skipped a beat. A safe. That was it. The missing link she needed. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. She felt a sense of urgency flood her veins. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to take care of it. I'll look into it right away." Sarah's voice was softer now, almost grateful. "I trust you, Karen. Please, please keep Leo safe. That's all I ask. I will, Sarah. I promise, Karen said firmly, her resolve hardening. She hung up the phone and sat back in her car for a moment, allowing the information to sink in. Leo's father, Jason, had been involved with dangerous people, and it seemed that the deeper this investigation went, the more it pointed to a criminal operation that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. As Karen drove away from the site, her mind was already racing through the next steps. She needed to find that safe. If Jason had left anything behind, anything that could provide a connection to these dangerous people, it could be the key to putting an end to this nightmare. And she was determined to do whatever it took to make sure that Leo, and everyone else involved, would never have to live in fear again. Karen's drive to the old house where Sarah and Leo had once lived was filled with tension. Her mind was racing, her thoughts bouncing from one theory to the next as she processed everything that had unfolded so far. Leo's story, the mysterious man watching her at the construction site, the key she had found, and now the cryptic mention of a safe, it all pointed to something far bigger than a simple case of a child running from dangerous people. As Karen navigated the familiar streets of Oak Ridge, the realization hit her with full force. This wasn't just about Leo. It wasn't just a personal vendetta from an ex-husband's dangerous connections. It was part of something far more sinister, something organized, well-funded, and connected to a network that spanned far beyond the confines of this city. What she had thought was a case of simple criminal activity was quickly turning into something she wasn't prepared for. The moment she arrived at the house, a small, modest home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, Karen immediately noticed the change in the air. The front door had been shut, but the windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. It felt abandoned, forgotten even. This was supposed to be Sarah's safe haven, a place where she and Leo had escaped the dangers of their past. But now, it seemed like the calm before the storm. As Karen approached the front door, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was being watched again. Her senses were on high alert, and every creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet seemed amplified in the otherwise silent street. She knocked firmly, once, twice, and then waited. There was no answer. A few moments later, Sarah's voice crackled through the intercom at the front gate. "Is that you, Karen?" she asked, her tone tight, as though she was nervous about something. "It's me," Karen responded, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "I'm here to check out the house, to see if we can find anything that might help us understand what's going on. I'll be quick." A few moments of silence passed before the gate creaked open, and Karen stepped inside, her hand instinctively resting on her sidearm. This wasn't just about finding a safe. She could feel the air of tension surrounding the house. The danger had escalated beyond Leo's immediate safety. Whoever was behind this, whatever network had been pursuing Leo and his family, was more organized than she could have imagined. Inside, Sarah met her at the door, looking tired but determined. Her face was drawn with worry, but there was something else in her eyes too, a resolve to face whatever was coming head-on. "I don't know what to think anymore," Sarah said softly as they walked through the living room, the scent of dust and old furniture lingering in the air. "I thought we were safe here, Karen. But now I feel like they're going to find us again, and I don't know why." "I know," Karen replied, her voice firm, "but we're going to figure it out. I need to check the house, see if there's anything that could explain all of this." She paused before adding, "Sarah, when you left Jason, did you ever get a sense of what he might have been involved in? I mean, was he in danger because of something he did? Or was it something that happened after you left?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes clouded with confusion. "I don't know. He never talked about it. But when I found out about the debts, about the people he owed money to, that's when I knew we couldn't stay there anymore. But I never imagined it would come to this, that they'd come after Leo." Karen nodded, understanding Sarah's fear. But she knew this wasn't about debts. This was bigger. This was organized crime, something far more dangerous. Something that had likely been in motion for years, with Leo and Sarah caught in the crossfire of something they didn't fully understand. They made their way to the basement where Jason had kept the safe, a place that had always felt like a hidden part of their lives. Sarah led Karen down the creaky wooden steps, and Karen's eyes immediately scanned the room for anything that stood out. It wasn't long before she noticed a small cabinet against the far wall, one that had clearly been moved. She approached it slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the final clue. The cabinet opened easily, revealing a small metal safe embedded into the back wall. The numbers, 312, were clearly visible on the front, exactly like the key she had found earlier. Karen's heart raced as she inserted the key into the lock, the metallic sound of the mechanism turning sharp in the quiet room. The safe clicked open. Inside, there were several items, paperwork, old files, and a stack of photographs, most of which were faded and yellowed with age. As Karen flipped through the files, she realized that many of them were linked to transactions, large sums of money, dates, names she didn't recognize. The nature of the documents pointed to something more than just a personal debt. These weren't simple bills or overdue payments. These were records of international dealings, money laundering, arms deals, and smuggling routes. Her heart dropped as she scanned the final page. There, in black ink, was the name, the broker, a name that appeared repeatedly in connection with various smuggling routes and covert operations. Karen's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a local criminal enterprise. This was a full-scale operation with international ties. And now, it seemed that Leo's family was wrapped up in the middle of it. Sarah had been unaware of the full extent of Jason's involvement, but now, it was all laid out in front of them. This smuggling network had been using Leo's father as a part of their operation, likely as a middleman, and when he tried to escape, he had sealed his family's fate. He'd put them in the crosshairs of some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. Sarah, Karen said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the information. Your husband wasn't just in debt to these people. He was working for them. This whole thing, it's a smuggling operation. The broker is at the center of it, and you and Leo are caught in the middle. Sarah looked pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, that can't be right. Jason wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have. Sarah, Karen interrupted gently. I'm not saying he chose this life willingly, but he was involved, and when he tried to leave, they came after him, and now they're coming after you and Leo. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with an unsettling clarity. This wasn't just a case of a child caught in the crossfire of a family dispute. Leo and Sarah's lives were being torn apart because of something far bigger, an international criminal network that had been operating under their noses. We need to get you both somewhere safe, Karen said, her voice firm. This is bigger than anything I've ever dealt with. These people, they won't stop until they get what they want. And right now, that's Leo. The safe house was supposed to be a place of sanctuary, a haven where Leo and Sarah could finally breathe without the looming threat of the dangerous people chasing them. Karen had taken every precaution, increasing security, ensuring that officers were stationed nearby, and promising Sarah that they were safe, at least for the time being. But deep down, Karen knew that safety was a fleeting illusion in a world where criminal networks like the one Leo's father had been involved with operated in the shadows. Still, she hoped that, for once, they might have a moment of peace. The small, secluded cabin sat nestled deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. The sound of nature, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, was the only thing that broke the silence. Officers were posted at the perimeter, the cabin's windows were secured, and everything was quiet. But Karen knew it was only a matter of time before the attackers found them. She could feel the tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. That storm arrived earlier than expected. It happened in the dead of night. Karen had just left the safe house after checking on Sarah and Leo, feeling the weight of the case pressing on her shoulders. The thought of the mysterious smuggling ring still haunted her. As she drove back to the station, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. She had spent the day reviewing the files she had gathered from the safe, piecing together the details of the broker's network. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The threat was no longer just about finding answers. It was about survival. Meanwhile, at the safe house, Sarah and Leo had settled into their temporary refuge. Leo had finally begun to feel more at ease after the ordeal at the construction site, and the dog, Shadow, stayed by his side, its presence providing some semblance of comfort. Sarah had tried to make the place feel as normal as possible for her son. She read to him in the small living room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Shadow lay at their feet, keeping watch, as it always did. For once, they felt like they could relax, just for a moment. But that moment didn't last. At first, it was a faint sound, a low rumble like the sound of tires crunching against gravel. The sound grew louder, closer, and before Sarah could even think, the front door burst open with a deafening crash. Masked intruders flooded into the room, their movements swift and calculated. Sarah's heart slammed in her chest, her mind going into overdrive. She could hear them shouting, their voices muffled through the masks, but their intent was clear. They weren't here to talk. "Stay down," one of the intruders barked, his voice cold and commanding. Another one quickly moved toward Sarah, his eyes scanning the room, his body language aggressive. The other two intruders fanned out, securing the perimeter, their weapons raised and ready. Shadow, the dog who had been so calm just moments before, now leapt into action with a ferocity that stunned Sarah. With a loud bark, it charged at the nearest intruder, its teeth bared and its body low to the ground. The man barely had time to react before Shadow lunged at him, sinking its teeth into his arm and knocking him off balance. The intruder shouted in pain as he tried to push the dog off, but Shadow's grip was unrelenting. "Get off me," the intruder yelled, flailing to free himself. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen Shadow act this way before. It was like the dog understood the stakes, understood that Leo's life was on the line. This wasn't just a pet trying to protect its owner. This was a loyal companion fighting for its family. "Leo, get upstairs," Sarah screamed, her voice desperate. She shoved her son toward the staircase, urging him to run. "Go. Now." Leo, wide-eyed and terrified, hesitated for a moment, but Shadow's fierce growl seemed to snap him out of his shock. Without a word, he sprinted up the stairs, his small legs carrying him as fast as he could manage. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him go, but there was no time to think. The attackers were closing in. As one of the intruders moved to intercept Leo, Shadow lunged again, this time toward the man trying to follow the boy. With a guttural snarl, the dog grabbed the intruder by the leg, knocking him backward. The man stumbled, cursing under his breath, but Shadow held on, refusing to let go. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah knew she couldn't just stand there. She had to act, and fast. Grabbing a heavy lamp from the side table, she swung it with all her strength at the nearest intruder, who was focused on the chaos Shadow was creating. The lamp connected with his head with a sickening thud, sending him sprawling to the floor. But there was no time to check if he was down for good. Sarah had to focus on getting Leo out of there. But as she turned to head toward the stairs, another intruder appeared at the top of them, blocking her way. He raised a gun, aiming it directly at her. Sarah's heart stopped for a moment, but before she could react, Shadow was there. The dog, still holding on to the other intruder, saw the threat and reacted with lightning speed. With a furious bark, Shadow launched itself at the man, tackling him to the ground, its jaws snapping. The gun fired once, but it missed, the bullet lodging harmlessly into the wall beside Sarah. The intruder, now on the ground, struggled to free himself, but Shadow wasn't letting go. With one final, powerful growl, the dog bit down hard on the man's arm, forcing him to drop the gun. "Go!" Sarah screamed at Leo, who had reached the top of the stairs. She ran toward him, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward the small hallway that led to their safe room. Shadow, still locked in combat with the last intruder, didn't give an inch. The dog's loyalty was unwavering. It wasn't going to let anything happen to Leo. As Sarah and Leo reached the room, she slammed the door behind them, locking it tightly. It wasn't over, but they had a moment of respite. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. But Sarah didn't know if it would be enough. The intruders were still here, and they weren't leaving quietly. She turned to Leo, pulling him into a tight hug as she whispered desperately, "We're going to be okay. I promise you." In the living room, Shadow's fierce growl could still be heard, but it was fading, signaling that the dog had succeeded in fending off the last of the attackers. The intruders had underestimated the power of the dog, the loyal protector who would never let anything happen to its family. Minutes later, the door to the safe house crashed open, and a team of officers stormed inside. Karen was among them, her expression grim as she quickly assessed the situation. She rushed toward Sarah and Leo, making sure they were safe. "Is everyone all right?" Karen asked, her voice filled with both relief and concern. Sarah nodded, still holding Leo close. "Thanks to Shadow, we're okay. But they came here. They attacked us." Karen's eyes immediately went to Shadow, who was now panting, his fur matted with blood, though his body was still firm and alert. She crouched down to pet him, her fingers running through the dog's fur. "Good boy," Karen whispered. "You saved them." Shadow wagged his tail weakly, as though understanding the praise. For a moment, everything seemed calm, but Karen knew this wasn't over. The intruders had tried to breach the safe house, and that meant one thing: they were closing in. This wasn't just about Leo anymore. This was war. And Karen wasn't about to let Leo and his family be caught in the middle of it. The tension that had been building for days reached a boiling point when Karen and her team finally tracked down the elusive leader of the smuggling operation, the broker. The pieces of the puzzle had started to fall into place over the past few days, as Karen pieced together the evidence from Leo's past, the key from the construction site, and the mysterious man who had been watching them. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The broker was at the heart of this entire operation. He was the one orchestrating the smuggling, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, and he had been watching Leo and his family closely for far too long. Karen sat in the operations room, her eyes fixed on the map spread out before her. The walls around her were plastered with photos, reports, and intelligence gathered over the course of the investigation. Each red line marked the paths of suspects, locations of interest, and routes tied to the smuggling operation that had wreaked havoc on Leo's life. She was no longer just dealing with petty criminals. This was a highly organized, international criminal syndicate, and its leader, the broker, was about to be brought to justice. Her hand rested on the radio, her fingers twitching slightly with anticipation as she listened to the comms operator relay the final updates. The broker's location had been pinpointed to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, deep in the industrial district. Karen's stomach tightened as she absorbed the details. This was it. They had him cornered. She stood up, her body rigid with focus. The time for strategy was over. Now, it was time for action. She turned to her team, a mixture of seasoned officers and new recruits, each one wearing the same look of determination on their faces. They had been through hell together over the past few days, and now they were going to finish this. Karen looked at them, her eyes sharp with purpose. "We move fast, and we move quiet. We don't know how many people the broker has with him, but we can't afford to let him get away. This ends tonight," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. With swift precision, the team geared up, and they loaded into the armored vehicles. The adrenaline was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Karen climbed into the lead vehicle, her hand instinctively resting on her sidearm, but her mind fully focused on what was to come. The broker had been elusive for far too long, always just out of reach. But tonight, that would change. The criminal empire he had built would come crashing down, piece by piece, starting with him. As they approached the warehouse, the city's industrial district loomed ahead, a maze of abandoned buildings and dark alleyways. The night was pitch black, with only the flicker of distant streetlights illuminating the narrow streets. The silence of the area felt unnatural, almost as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Karen knew they were getting close. The convoy stopped several blocks away from the warehouse, and Karen gave the signal for the team to disembark. They moved swiftly, like shadows in the night, their footsteps quiet as they approached the building. Karen's heart raced in her chest, the weight of the moment hanging heavily over her. This was it. They were about to confront the man who had put Leo and his family through hell, the man who had caused so much destruction and pain. The team spread out, taking positions around the perimeter of the warehouse. Karen crouched down behind a stack of crates, her eyes scanning the darkened windows for any sign of movement. The silence felt oppressive, and the tension in the air was nearly unbearable. She could feel the eyes of her team on her, waiting for her command. "On my mark," Karen whispered into her radio, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. 3, 2, 1. With a signal from Karen, the team moved in. The doors of the warehouse were already partially ajar, likely left open by the broker's men, unaware that they were about to be caught in a trap. As Karen and her team entered the warehouse, the sound of their boots on the concrete floor echoed in the stillness, but there was no turning back now. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of scattered lamps and the reflection of their flashlights bouncing off the steel beams above. And then, Karen saw him. The broker stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by armed guards who were either too slow or too unprepared to react in time. The broker was a tall man, his posture relaxed but with an air of arrogance that made him seem untouchable. He had been waiting for this moment, Karen realized, waiting for them to come after him. He turned toward her, his face betraying no surprise. "Detective Mitchell," he said coolly, his voice smooth as silk. "I've been expecting you." Karen didn't flinch. She took a step forward, her weapon drawn and pointed directly at him. "You're under arrest," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "You're going to pay for everything you've done." The broker smiled, his lips curling in amusement. "You think arresting me will change anything? You think taking me down will stop this?" He motioned to the dark corners of the warehouse, where shadows seemed to dance. "You're just a cog in the wheel. There's a much larger operation than you can ever imagine." Before Karen could respond, one of the guards lunged at her, a gun raised. But Karen was quicker. She fired a shot, knocking the weapon from the guard's hand before he could even pull the trigger. The room erupted into chaos as the remaining guards scrambled to defend themselves. "Take them down," Karen shouted, and her team moved into action, each officer expertly disarming and subduing the armed men. The air was thick with gunfire, but Karen remained focused on the broker, her eyes never leaving him. The broker's smile faded as the reality of the situation set in. He tried to move toward the back of the warehouse, but Karen was already there, blocking his escape route. "This is over," she said, her tone final. "You've run long enough." In a final, desperate attempt, the broker reached into his jacket, pulling out a small handgun. But before he could aim it, Karen's team had him surrounded. One of the officers quickly disarmed him, taking the weapon from his hand with practiced precision. "Not so confident now, are you?" Karen said as she stepped forward, her voice laced with determination. The broker was finally in her grasp. His reign of terror was over. The team quickly cuffed him, and Karen placed him in a secure holding area. As she stood over him, the full weight of the investigation began to settle in. She had taken down the man who had been pulling the strings, the mastermind behind the entire operation. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. With the broker in custody, Karen knew they had the information they needed to take down the rest of the network. The smuggling ring that had been operating in the shadows was now exposed, and its collapse was imminent. But as Karen looked down at the broker, a cold smile on his face despite his capture, she couldn't help but wonder what other secrets he was hiding. The information he held would lead them deeper into the world of crime, and she was ready to follow it to the end. The broker was arrested. His network was beginning to unravel. But Karen knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over. The days following the broker's arrest were a blur of paperwork, follow-up investigations, and debriefings. The smuggling operation that had terrorized Leo and his family for so long was rapidly falling apart, the pieces of the criminal network scattered and broken. Each arrest, each piece of intelligence gained, led to more arrests and more information. But despite the relief that came with every criminal taken off the streets, Karen found herself unable to shake the memory of Leo's terrified face, of the moments when she had held the boy in her arms, desperate to protect him from the unknown danger that lurked in the shadows. She had done it. She had brought the broker to justice, and the rest of his network was unraveling fast. But there was still the matter of Sarah and Leo's future. The fight wasn't over for them. It never truly was. Their lives had been irrevocably changed by forces beyond their control, and Karen knew that her mission wasn't finished until she could ensure their safety, for good. As she sat in her office, reviewing the final reports, Karen felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the realization that the case was only one chapter of a much bigger story. The justice system would do its part. The criminals would be taken down, one by one. But the scars of this ordeal would remain for Leo and his mother for a long time. Karen's thoughts were interrupted when she heard a knock at the door. "Come in," Karen called, looking up from her desk. The door creaked open, and in walked Sarah, her face tired but filled with gratitude. Beside her stood Leo, a small, tentative smile on his face. The once terrified boy who had been so afraid for his life was now standing strong, his eyes not filled with fear, but with something much more resilient: hope. Shadow, the dog who had stood guard at their side through it all, trotted in behind them, its tail wagging with an almost human-like sense of pride. Such terror, his determination to survive against all odds, it had left an impression on Karen she would never forget. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah," Karen said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You and Leo are the ones who showed the most courage. It was an honor to help you." Sarah smiled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from her shoulders. "You didn't just help us survive, Karen," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You gave us hope. I didn't think I'd ever see the day where Leo could sleep peacefully again, where we could look forward to something other than fear. But now we're safe." Karen looked down at Leo, who was holding Shadow's leash, his fingers curled tightly around the handle. "You're safe now, Leo. That's what matters," she said gently, crouching down to his level. Leo looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his smile reached his eyes. "Thank you, Karen," he said, his voice quiet but filled with warmth. "Thank you for saving us." Karen's heart swelled with emotion. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about stopping criminals. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about the people she had helped, the lives she had impacted. And in some small way, they had changed her, too. She had always known that being a cop was about protecting others, about seeking justice. But she had never fully understood the depth of that responsibility until now. "Well, you've got Shadow to thank, too," Karen said with a soft chuckle, nodding toward the dog who was now sitting obediently beside Leo. "That dog was the real hero." Sarah laughed softly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I think Shadow would agree." Karen stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the city beyond. The world had been turned upside down for Leo and Sarah, but now they had a chance to rebuild. The darkness of their past was behind them, and ahead of them lay the possibility of a future free from fear. It wasn't perfect. Life never was. But it was theirs, and that, Karen realized, was enough. She looked back at the family, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "You're going to be okay, Sarah. You and Leo. You've been through so much, but now, you've got each other. And that's the most important thing." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "We have you to thank for that. You made sure we had each other." Karen smiled, her gaze lingering on Leo, who was now sitting on the couch, petting Shadow. She knew that, in some ways, Leo would carry the scars of his past with him, but he would also carry something else: the resilience, the strength, and the bravery he had shown through it all. He would grow up knowing that despite everything, he had survived, and he would never forget the people who fought for him, for his family. As Sarah and Leo made their way to the door, Karen stood there, watching them go. They were safe now. The criminals were behind bars, and the smuggling ring that had plagued them was dismantled. But there was a deeper victory here, one that couldn't be measured in arrests or criminal convictions. It was the victory of the human spirit, the courage to face fear and fight for what was right. Karen stepped back into her office and sat at her desk, looking over the case file one last time. The job wasn't over. There would always be more cases, more lives to protect. But she had learned something invaluable through this one. Courage and resilience weren't just about surviving. They were about pushing forward, about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about holding on to hope even when it seemed like there was none left. Karen's reflection was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Karen," Sarah called from the hallway, her voice warm, "we're heading out now. I just wanted to say one last time, thank you." Karen smiled softly, her heart full. "Take care of each other, Sarah. And don't forget, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." With that, Sarah and Leo left, and Karen watched them walk out of the precinct together, their steps light, their futures bright. And as she watched them go, Karen couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that, in some small way, she had made a difference. The fight for justice was ongoing, and there would always be more to do. But for now, Karen could rest easy, knowing that for one family, the darkness had finally lifted. And that, she thought as she leaned back in her chair, was the real victory.